Solutions for a Changing World for the 12th International Youth Conference. Our panel today show us the money from ffd-4 to SDG Summit 2027, a dialogue on means of implementation comes at a truly pivotal moment in multilateral policy and towards the road to Agenda 2030. Just 3 months ago, over 15,000 delegates gathered at Seville for the fourth International Conference on Financing for Development, a landmark event that was framed as a once-in-a-decade opportunity to reshape our global financial architecture. The FFD Children and Youth constituency of the Major Group for Children and Youth facilitated participation for children and youth, more than 250 of them, and produced a 120-page long position paper. Now, the position paper is used for subsequent advocacy, including in the negotiations for the United Nations Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation, the annual meetings of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and other follow-up processes related to ffd-4. The constituency also hosted the Global Children and Youth Forum on Financing for Development a day before the actual ffd-4 conference in Seville and virtually. And this engagement built on the work of MGCY during the prep cons to ffd-4. Now, the commitment made in the outcome document and the launch of the Sevilla Platform for Action provides us with both ambition and urgency to mobilize resources, unlock financing, and chart a fairer economic pathway towards the SDGs. Alongside this, the adoption of the Global Digital Compact during the 2024 Summit of the Future has set the stage for a new chapter in digital cooperation and governance, one that promises human rights in the web, inclusivity in the digital economy, and stronger global frameworks on artificial intelligence and innovation. The Youth Science Policy Interface Platform, convened by MGCY, brings together hundreds of youth groups and networks on science, technology, innovation, STI topics. Leading up to the adoption of the Pact for the Future and the Global Digital Compact, the youth constituency coordinated over 60 youth consultations across 36 countries, focusing on the 5 pillars of the Global Digital Compact. Additionally, the constituency facilitated the participation of more than 70 children and youth at the STI Forum and in HLPF, including those with doctoral degrees and other advanced degrees in fields like AI, computing, and other emerging technologies. Yet, for children and youth, the journey towards these milestones have not been easy. Youth have expertise to lead discussions on these pivotal topics of the decade and need to be recognized as independent international scientific panel on artificial intelligence. But the future of implementation, the means by which the SDGs are realized, depends on effective intergenerational dialogue and a meaningful inclusion of children and youth as co-creators to multilateral policy. This morning, we'll hear from a distinguished set of panelists who bring diverse intergenerational expertise. Together, we'll reflect on the financing gaps that remain, the systemic reforms that we urgently need, and how children and youth can be placed in the center of solutions as we look ahead to the SDG Summit in 2027. I'd like to encourage all of our distinguished panelists and all of our participants here today to keep in mind not only the challenges we face, but also the diverse sets of opportunities we have in our hands, on how global commitments can be effectively translated into practical and inclusive action, and how this session can identify areas of priority where intergenerational cooperation is simply essential. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists. So we have Ms. Yu-Ping Chan, the Head of Digital Partnerships and Engagement at the United Nations Development Program. And we're also joined by Ms. Shari Spiegel, the Director of the Financing for Sustainable Development Office at the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, and Mr. Michael Lihanda, the Special Advisor to the Observer of the Office of the Observer of the DMUN Foundation to the United Nations headquarters. We will now proceed with short interventions from each of our panelists during a tour of the table. Each panelist will be invited to respond briefly to one common question, along with one specific question based on their expertise and work. Following this, we will transition into an interactive dialogue, during which members of the audience will be invited to share comments and pose questions to our distinguished panel. So let me start with the common question. Which commitment from the Sevilla Platform of Action should be prioritized before the SDG Summit 2027 in order to deliver effective progress on the Sustainable Development Goals? And for another topic you could mention is the Global Digital Compact. So Sevilla Platform of Action and the Global Digital Compact. And I'd like to first give the floor to Michael, if you'd like to start.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to see you all. So the specific forum that I'd like to talk about is the fact that the DGC will be more invested in financing for development this time around. So we talk about financing at the United Nations, and it's obviously an outdated issue. I mean, post-World War II, the financing aspects, especially in the digital market space, couldn't have been predicted. We have different implementations such as AI and all these different digital uses, which means that for consideration for financing, we need the digital aspect as well. So this was done through the DGC and their collaboration in the convening of financing for development. So something I'd also like to mention over here is the fact that the youth should be involved in these processes just as much as technology is used, because something I'd like to talk about is why be spectators to our own future, essentially. For real digital cooperation, especially given that the youth drive and are the stakeholders of many AI and many innovations in the tech market space, we need them to be invested in these roles, which means that moving past financing for development, adding on changes for youth implementation, for youth perspective to be there, especially for those under the age of 18, is something that's extremely imperative. I think that through financing, also taking in different gestures, such as AI and its implementations, and looking at that from a financial perspective, we need the youth perspective there, and it's something that's really important.
I'd like to give the floor to now Ms. Director Spiegel, please.
Thanks so much. And I guess this is an intergenerational conversation, I guess I'm at the top of the generational in terms of age. But so really a pleasure to be here. So the discussions we just had in Sevilla is part of what's called the Financing for Development process. And if I may just to very quickly give, if people don't know what this is, it's, the title of this is from, well, I forgot the exact title, but Show Us the Money. But financing for development is not really about money. It is. Finance needs to be there. But it's really more as much about the policies and policy frameworks, both at the national level and the global level, that shape the international financial architecture to incentivize and lead to where the money goes. There's tons of money out there. The problem is that money's not going to the global goals, to all of our goals as much as we need. There's a $4 trillion gap in financing for development in developing countries alone to achieve the SDGs every year. So the question that was thought about in Sevilla was, what do we need to do to the global financial architecture of the system to revamp it, to make it fit for purpose in today's global challenges? Technology is part of it. It's not the only part of it. And there are lots of discussions and thoughts about how technology is changing the architecture, but the architecture, many of the fundamental economic laws stay the same. So it's a question of how this all fits together. There are 7 chapters we look at, which includes domestic resource mobilization, which is the tax policy and we have a separate tax negotiation happening at the same time for international tax cooperation. It's private finance, it's development cooperation, which includes aid, the multilateral development bank system, South-South cooperation, it's international public finance. And then what we think of as these big systemic issues, such as international trade, sovereign debt issues. A lot of countries have enormous amounts of debt payments that they have to make that leave no room for them to spend money on their budgets on their people. And then the financial architecture itself and technology. So that's what we cover. The SPA, the Sevilla Platform for Action, we had a consensus agreement, though before the agreement, the United States disassociated. So you can understand that if we're talking about some of these big issues like trade, where we have tariffs happening, that the United States is a big part of, with them not being there, we can't solve that. There are questions of development cooperation, where official development assistance has been going down at a time when needs are going up, and military spending is going up at the same time. But a discussion is probably not going to change that trend either. So we really wanted to focus on what the international agreements could change, and this SPA, the Sevilla Platform for Action, were coalitions of countries coming together to say, we're going to start implementing this now, with or without the rest of you, to show that there are groups of countries coming together to say, we're going to start implementing some of this now. So two issues to just highlight that were really big. One is filling this $4 trillion gap, this question of how to help countries that want to their domestic resource mobilization was a big part of the discussion. The development bank system, trying to triple lending from the public development bank system. And then how do we better incentivize and regulate private finance so that it goes into global needs. So that's one big chunk of the issues. And the second big set of issues is on sovereign debt. So I don't know how much many of you follow these issues, but developing countries spend, the poorest countries in the world spend on average 12% of their budgets to finance for debt payments. Some countries spend 70, 80% of their budgets to finance that. That means that in most, I forget the number of countries that we have, but many, many countries are spending more on debt payments than health and education together. And so the question of how to reduce the debt burden on these countries is a really big part of the discussion. And there were some big agreements on ways to move forward on that issue in Sevilla as well. So I'll stop there and then see as the conversation continues.
Thank you very much. I think FFD is a truly very crucial and intersectional issue, but not a lot of children and youth know about what exactly is FFD and what exactly is the processes that make up this FFD process. And I think the summary that you've provided is definitely very helpful and really sets the foundations for the discussions we'll have today. And so one part of this means of implementation is definitely FFD. Now the other part is what we call science, technology, and innovation. So now I'd like to invite Ms. Chan for her remarks.
Jaewon, thank you so much for having me here today. And can I start by congratulating all of you guys for your commitment to this issue and being here in a packed room on Saturday after UNGA. So really, it shows the passion, the drive, and the commitment that you guys have to be part of this creation of the future and really thinking about what your contribution can be. So I'll focus, I think Shari's gone over the FFD. I'll talk a little bit more on the digital side, what the UN is doing in that space, and what I think, exactly as you pointed out, how we bring this intersection of digital and youth as part of that sort of engine for change going forward. So the Global Digital Compact, as Jaewon has pointed out, was adopted at the Summit of the Future last year, where it lays out a vision for a more inclusive digital future. It has elements such as closing global digital divide, artificial intelligence, and capacity building and so forth. But the really interesting part, I think, is exactly what you pointed out. What is the role that you can play as part of the defining of the problem, and then the solution of finding the money, or making sure that the money goes to the right places? There are elements in there that you've already spoken about, the potential of artificial intelligence and digital technologies. An ITU UNDP study has shown that over 70% of the Sustainable Development Goals can be accelerated and enabled by the use of digital technologies. There are creative innovation solutions out there that leverage digital to achieve a lot of the goals of the SDGs. And a lot of these innovations don't come just from the global north, but are being pioneered in the global south, where you have entrepreneurs and local ecosystems, startups that are responding to the particular needs in a country to find solutions that work in their country. So how then can we drive the money to these types of innovations, scale them up globally, and make sure that the global south countries are part of the digital and AI revolution? So I think Shari spoke about how the conversations at Sevilla were about how technology can change the financial architecture. I think it might have to go a little bit beyond that to think about how technology is actually part of the future, not just changing the financial architecture, but as a means to actually then create the future that we actually want. So in terms of, for instance, driving investments towards digital capacity building for you, AI skills, STEM ecosystems, about how you, for instance, create regulation or innovate in such a way that local ecosystems and startups in the global south are actually supported, and how this is part of the development policy of a country itself. So that's where UNDP comes in. We are the United Nations Development Group. We are in 170 countries and territories around the world. We sit at the right hand of government in thinking about how they bring about development, how they find financial resources from the rest of the international system, how they channel it productively, sustainably, and equitably in their country itself around health, education, climate priorities, youth, and so forth. And so this is why I think we really need the youth to mobilize around calling for greater investments by your national governments in these types of enabling infrastructure and ecosystems that focus on digital AI, digital literacy, digital entrepreneurship, with a focus on the young. Because, as Sherry says, we're on the older end of the spectrum. I like to think I'm a bit in the middle. But I myself recognize that I have no idea what the future will bring and what are these technological innovations via digital and AI that really can drive this kind of development. And this is why I think the role of the major group on youth and children, all of you going back home and going around the world must spread that kind of messaging to say youth should not just be present in the conferences, submitting a paper, but active creators of the type of solutions, infrastructure, ecosystems that financing globally needs to go towards. And that's where really I think you have to be even more activist in what you do. Really bring these types of thoughts, innovations. Some of you might be involved in startups or local businesses. Bring these types of solutions to the global stage and make sure they're part of the consideration of the global system around the financing goal forward. So in the Global Digital Compact, in the General Assembly's coming review of the WISIS process, that's the World Summit on Information Society, that's another General Assembly process that's coming out later this year. How do we make sure that youth is front and center in our considerations of the future? How do we drive enough financing, capacity development, skills for you to be part of that revolution going forward, and making sure that even if you go beyond the UN to your respective fields, business, government, public sector, NGO, civil society activism, you have those types of awareness of digital skills and digital opportunity to lend your advocacy even more active voice. So I'll stop there and say that at the United Nations Development Program, we're very proud to partner with the NGOs in a lot of things around these aspects of making sure that AI and digital are more equitable and more inclusive. I think there was talk, for instance, around the Sevilla outcome, that there wasn't enough focus on intergenerational equity. I think that's something that we also need to think about when it comes to digital space, precisely because, as you said, youth are the creators of the digital future. You have understandings and skills that we don't have. But I also would like you guys to think about not just intergenerational equity, but inter-country equity, right? It is a shame that, for instance, that only, I believe the stat is 95% of the top global AI talent in the world comes from 6 research institutions that are concentrated in 2 countries. Studies have shown that of the economic value that AI will generate by 2030, I think it's around 30 trillion, only 10% will accrue to the global north. So not just intergenerational equity, let's also talk about what it means to have equity for the global south and the developing countries of the world. So I'll stop there, and I'm really open to hearing your thoughts and having a conversation after.
Yes, I want to express so much appreciation for what you said for the work that youth and children should do, which I think often a lot of people view MGCY in terms of our engagement just be limited in specific conferences or UN processes. But I think the overall vision is we want to mobilize every single children and youth that's present without regards to geographic barriers, right? We want them to be activists and leaders of advocacy, not only in these conference rooms, as you said, but actually on the ground implementing these projects. And I think that very much would, I believe, contribute to the mandate's delivery of UNDP, right? Because if you are, as you described it, the right kind of government for how they bring about development, it is truly effective when we have every part, every generation really involved in that important task. Now, I want to move to more specific questions to each of our panelists. So I want to start with Ms. Chan, and in what ways children and youth are being referenced in the outcomes of the Global Digital Compact. And I think a side question to that would be, how can children and youth really be meaningfully integrated into the preparatory process for the 2027 SDG Summit, especially on the links to the digital economy and the digital world?
Thank you, Jae-Won. I think I alluded a little bit to this, right? On the second question, how I think you guys need to be part of the preparatory work going forward. I think you need to, exactly as Jae-Won says, not just be consulted in documents or president meetings. You also need to think about what practical solutions and approaches you bring. What youth-led innovations, youth-led activism in your national ecosystems has had impact. And think about how these can inform the global work that's already going on. Because so often, a lot of these discussions are really conducted by older people, where there is this preference for research publications and experience that's measured in time and years that isn't necessarily reflective of the concept. So, for instance, a recent example, the Secretary General of the UN just launched a call for nominations to the Global Scientific Panel on AI. That was part of the Global Digital Compact. So the UN is going to establish a global panel on AI that talks about the key issues in AI, as well as a global AI dialogue. In the call for nominations to the panel, the reference is to experience. And so, you're asked to provide the number of research publications you've done, your number of years in the field. And that, by definition, already excludes young people. So like, how can you guys also be part of these types of work? I think we as this UN need to think about how to structurally embed this a little bit better. In the Global Digital Compact, for instance, we refer to youth in the context of children's rights online. Around, for instance, I believe digital capacity building, we talk about youth participation and so forth. But I think we need even more of what I said. This notion of how youth and youth innovation, youth entrepreneurship, youth-led solutions can be part of that digital future going forward. And so, for instance, you referred to the fact that UNDP has been working with youth around the world. So, for instance, in Albania, in Turkey, in the Asia Pacific, we have national digital youth programs that look at training of youth and really inculcating that ability of youth to contribute. I think we need to make sure that in the coming negotiations, be it around the Global Digital Compact, the World Summit, and then especially just moving forward around the FFD type processes, that youth element and that focus on delivering resources to these types of youth innovation, building youth ecosystems, digital capacity building is front and center in a lot of these priorities. Because again, too often the conversations are being held by older people, diplomats, technical people that really are not, they say youth and they say it is important, but they don't really think about what needs to be financed, resourced, and supported. And that's where I think the major group of youth, the children, your own advocacy networks will be very important in informing those types of conversations.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the example that you gave there about the nominations to the Global Scientific Panel on AI, on how the very virtue of prioritizing applications that ask for experience sort of excludes young people, right? Because we don't have that much experience. Of course, we have
research publications, or PhDs, and so forth.
Right, no, definitely. And I think those are some of the examples we see across the multilateral system, across the UN system, where when we go by merit, often we sometimes exclude some of the most marginalized and vulnerable groups that represent a great portion of our world. And I think that most certainly that includes children and youth. And I think what you said about the outcomes of the Global Digital Compact on enhancing the rights of children online is also a very important element. I think there's a division between the rights and privileges that young people over the age of 18 get versus young people under the age of 18. You know, I think that's why we have the whole convention on the rights of the child. I think children definitely are at the most marginalized segment of the wider demographic of youth. And I really appreciate for you for highlighting that. And I want to now ask this question in a very similar vein to the Director Spiegel. And so in your view, how can the participation of children and youth rights holders be further strengthened in the FFD implementation, especially in nexus bodies under the Financing for Sustainable Development Office, such as the UN Tax Convention process or the Expert Body on Tax and other related ECOSOC processes?
Okay, great, thanks so much. And I would say that, and it's sort of building on what was just said, because ultimately it's not what happens in the UN discussions, it's what happens on the ground and in lives and in the framework that's going to determine where the world's going to go in the future. And so the first, I think the most important thing is, what are your priorities and how are you going to bring those discussions? What are you going to say? It's the participation, there's space, there's not that much space, but there's some. And the youth group was very, very important in the discussions leading up to the Sevilla, was very, very active in all of the preparatory committee meetings and in the conference itself. But one of the questions is, and when we look at the whole financing set of issues, there's the issue of technology and digitization and digital equity and all of these questions and how that's, there's also questions of financial markets, which are incredibly short-sighted and incredibly short-term oriented. There are political processes, which are also incredibly short-term oriented. And financial markets are pro-cyclical and volatile because of the short-term orientation. And that leads to outcomes that are not going to benefit the future in the sense that we need. And so this question of, as youth, what are the priorities? What do you need from the system for you? And it's a question, yes, on the global, yes, in regional forum as well. There are regional forum in each of these areas and then on the national level. How can you get, because the global discussions end up, it is policymakers who make these choices. It is your governments, and they end up reflecting what happens, their views from the ground. And so how do you influence in your own countries the perspectives to bring to these discussions to advocate for the positions that are really important to you? And so I think that the meetings are good, but that's not it's how do you change those meetings, and what do you need from the system to make it work for the future, which is all of you. And particularly then the second set of questions I think is, and this really brings in the question of tax, because the tax discussions, again, you have been very active in the first two sessions, and that's been really important. And the tax discussions are incredibly technical. I'm an economist, I've worked on these issues forever. I at some point in the tax discussions, I'm not there anymore. I can't be part of it so much because I'm not a tax expert. And so there's another set of questions of how do you engage in these incredibly technical discussions to bring your points in when you would, and what is the capacity building you need? And so I think that's something we can all work on together, is to be in those discussions. How can we work together to strengthen the capacity and the knowledge on these very, very technical issues? Because if you need to be able to speak the language, understand the issues, to know what to advocate for, and then to know how to articulate that in a way that these people are going to listen to. And so that's a gap I think that we need to work on together to try to solve, to make sure that in those 3 minutes you're given, which is not very much, how do you succinctly and quickly articulate the points that really need to be brought into that discussion, and particularly in these very, very technical discussions.
Right, and I think what you said about capacity building, the need for capacity building, I think it's very important, and I think that's something that we see across the entire UN system, and there's very much a lot of technical processes being administered across the system, right? I mean, the recent BB&J, which is based on the UN law, received very technical ffd. As you said, tax requires a lot of specialized knowledge, and I think this is truly a need that we have as children and youth, because often we have young people who are interested in engaging, but yet when they try to engage, we, as you said, lack that knowledge, right? Because we want to make sure that, the people who negotiate in those areas, right, who are experts in their field, believe that we have enough justification to provide our inputs and will actually listen to us. And I think that point is very important. And also the question about, they say use is very important, right? But how do we actually implement it, right? Because in terms of when we actually get to the financing element, right, it's still very verbal, right? We don't have actual action oriented in it. And I think it is truly our goal as advocates to sort of connect the gap with, and to really build that bridge between our goal that we want to achieve and the commitments that are that the multilateral system is making. Now I want to hand the floor over to Michael. And so reflecting on your personal engagement throughout the road to Seville, how would you assess the status of meaningful and effective participation of children and youth during ffd-4 and its preparatory process? How do you think, as a children and youth yourself, we could really bring that further in this process in ffd-5 and through the process of implementation?
Well, first, I think that's something that we have to address as a significant roadblock. Children and youth encounter several roadblocks throughout the entire stages of ffd-4. First of all, the age requirement, right? Age restriction, 18 years of age or older, meaning that children, people under the age of 18, were not able to contribute meaningfully to any of the processes going on in ffd-4. So let's look at the people who didn't have senior advisory roles, who were there and still were able to contribute to the meaningful caucus order. Well, it was pageantry, right? They weren't able to have full policy oversight on any of the policies being moved, and the youth perspective was simply gleaned into interventions, speeches, audible words, where ambassadors could have been on their phones, where people could have been paying attention, and the youth perspective, to put it in short, wasn't taken in at all. Children were met with eligibility requirements that prohibited them from participating in the main sessions of ffd-4, and this goes for the children and youth who are over the age of 18. So with this limited youth access, the youth constituency specifically lacked plentiful opportunities to contribute perspectives and findings to the conference plenary sessions, right? And you asked about personal experience in these areas. Personally, I am 15 years of age, right? So when I'm in these high-level rounds, I was speaking at the MGCY Youth Fest that was hosted not a few days ago now. I was speaking to a room of around 40 people under the age of 18, going over how they can meaningfully engage in the processes of the United Nations General Assembly. And I had to give it to them honestly. If you have the chance to represent children and youth at a high level, such as United Nations General Assembly or ffd-4, you need to represent to the highest extent, because there are people all over the world that may have not been able to afford the travel, people who may have not been able to afford any of the accommodations to be able to represent, and you represent an entire audience. It's a very, very loud minority that we have to represent. I think that moving forward in the future, the specific NIOs, like as I like to speak over here, we need to address systemic issues, right? Youth should be engaged in identifying, resolving pressing ideas, issues that hamper the effective operationalization and mandate delivery of MIOs, such as sovereign debt, illicit financial flows, right? And financing gaps for sustainable development goals, right? So then there's nexus processes for financing and digital governance as a whole. Like what you were saying about this beforehand, the inclusion should prioritize involvement in key linked processes, right? So we have the FFD nexus, United Nations Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation, and the Economic Social Council's Committee on Independent Experts in International Cooperation in Tax Matters, right? All of these things the youth needs to be engaged in, and this should be beyond interventions. This should be in statements that are actually written into paper that cannot be ignored. 100 speeches can be given from 100 different members of the youth, but if one of those speeches is actually implemented into an outcome document, maybe we'd see real change, and maybe we'd see real meaningful implementation from members of the youth. I think that moving forward for future processes at ffd-4, for the ongoing process of United Nations General Assembly, we need to think about how the youth can not only be codified into a significant role, but also how the pageantry level of youth inclusion in these different spaces should be stratified. It shouldn't be there. The youth should have a voice, and that voice should be written into legal text.
Well, thank you.
Can I respond to that a little bit?
Please.
So, because I think your point, I think your point that the events are pageantry is correct. It's the entire conference is a pageantry. It's not just youth. It's that's what it is. It's a place, and in fact, the agreement happens before you get there usually. So the agreement happens in the preparatory process where the group was also involved. And so I think that it's the structures that exist are, I believe the reason that no one below 18 is allowed in is an insurance question. So, and I think it's broader than FFD, it's across the board on many of these conferences. And so I think that, yes, advocate to change the rules, and that means there are bigger rules in the UN, and some can be changed and some can't. I can tell you, as someone who works there, that to change things in the structures is a big job and doesn't happen very easily, and it's not, but also then think about how your voices are heard given the rules that are there. So I think you need to do both at the same time and come up with a strategy. I think we in the Secretariat, but even member states, there's an eagerness to hear youth voices. Yes, it's lip service, but maybe take advantage of that lip service. Mm-hmm. Take advantage of the fact that now there's a question of, we all want to hear what youth have to say. So then come and say something, write the papers, bring them. We as a Secretariat will share them with the working groups that exist, even if they're, we are all here to bring your voices in, but come up with, the question is, what are the most important issues on illicit financial flows? What do you want to say? And what do we want to bring to those discussions? We can help you do that. Those over 18 can come do that while you try to change the rules as well. Good luck to that. So I think you need to, it would be really great to think and to organize yourselves in a way to be able to get the best ideas and bring them to the discussions and take advantage of lip service. Okay, when there's lip service, that's still an opportunity to say, let's make you come ahead and let's see you actually act on that now. And we in the Secretariat are very much eager and happy to work with you to bring in the voices as much as possible. But the conferences themselves are pageantry. They're for all of us. They're pageantry.
So just speaking on that, I think really, very frankly, I used to be a diplomat at the UN, so I sort of know how these negotiations play out, what is influential and what isn't. I would suggest, for instance, that if you really want to strike home this point of what you want to see change in diplomatic text and negotiating text, already have this position formed quite early on and simplify it down to, let's say, 4 or 5 really big paragraph asks, right? That is very specific. You want a certain thing to occur in the outcome text. And then you get every single group that is speaking, youth group, associated group, in whatever form, just echoing from that same single script around these 5 priorities over and over again. So you say to every single ambassador that you meet, you make sure that globally all the youth are united around these 4 or 5 key asks that you want as the outcome from the text negotiations or from the FFD, from the Global Digital Compact. And that same message is echoed and reinforced in every single place that you meet, in through your own society networks, your community networks, in country level, or even globally as well. The more there is coalescence around these clear objectives, the harder it is for the pageantry, the lip service, the ambassadors, the member states to ignore. And so even though they will sit, checking their phone during the meeting, if after the meeting, you guys just reiterate the 5-paragraph, 5 asks in the same document that everyone is using and circulating around the UN, that is the thing that will land impact. Because at the end of the day, it is true. The member states, they're complicated, they're diplomatic, they're political. But if there is a clarion call united from youth all around the world, there is uniting youth, not just from the global south, not just from the global north, but across all these types of platforms, it will be very hard for the United Nations and the diplomats and the technocrats to ignore that. So I do think this idea of coalescing around key outcomes, concrete, clear ones, I appreciate the very detailed reports, I do. But you do also know that people will not go through 38 pages, right? They want a 2-pager, sexy with graphics, very quick summary that they can just take out there and say, this is what we want to put in.
And we have to learn the same thing. Like we do the 38, 60-page, 100-page papers, and then we spend a lot of time distilling it down to those 4 points. You need the deep research, or you don't know what you want to say, and then you need to figure out how you communicate that.
And that is the strategy for impact.
Right, exactly. And we're all learning it. Like that was not how we did it when I was younger, but it is. So you're going to learn it young and be able to bring those skills through as you
TikTok campaigns where everybody is calling for those 4 or 5 things, a global social media campaign, really having creative ways of displaying this type of messaging at the UN. That is going to be what catches attention.
And it used to be the case they read the 60-page papers. They don't anymore.
Yeah.
So now you still need them, but then you need to figure out how to and you guys are going to be much better at that than any of us, at least in my age. I'm in my 60s now. So.
Well, this is a lot of helpful advice personally as someone who is participating in MGCY's FFD constituency. And I think as MGCY, we've always relied on the support of Secretariat to really facilitate the participation there. And I think we're very much grateful for what the FSDO has done during the FFD and tax process. We had 6 funded slots for use, and we had umbrella accreditations, so we could send more participants than ever. And we had youth interventions in 3 of the 6 interactive dialogues and support for the youth forum. And I think because of the willingness of different UN system agencies and members of the Secretariat, especially the FSDO, that is why we are able to engage and attend in these places. And I think, of course, there is still systemic barriers, but the main thing that I think we really need to recognize is that we have the support of the Secretariat, so we can physically be present there. And I really agree with most of your ideas on condensing the different opinions from children and youth and having a unified position on these different processes and thematic issues. We've seen success with that, right? Yungo with UNFCCC and different very large youth constituencies that make significant impact in their respective processes have succeeded with that key element of we need to unite as one. That is the impact that will exponentially increase the impact we can deliver as a constituency and as a rights holder group. And I think that is the path that definitely that FFD youth, children and youth constituency should take. And I think this is really a good place to really spread that feedback out to all the wider youth community, all the wider youth organization members that's listening into this conversation right now. And when the topic of listening to youth comes, I think this is a great segue to actually provide opportunity for members of the audience, both online and both in person, to ask any questions or provide any comments to our distinguished panelists. If you would like to speak, we just have a chair right here, so if you would like to come and speak, please raise your hand. Yes, please.
So thank you everyone, and Raisha, the local high school here in New York. Thank you everyone for their great insights regarding youth organization and how can you and lead change. I just have a question regarding how do you think youth from third world countries who doesn't have access to like this for us, how do you think they can participate and they can also have opportunities to bring change? in their own country and provide solutions that will solve or have or help change the problems they're having right now.
Right. We'll combine 2 to 3 questions, and then we'll give the time for reflections. Is there any other questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, but, so you actually spoke about right to research papers. So what is the modality of submission? What kind of papers are you looking at? And how do we get it through maybe the review process of it if someone wants to submit it?
Is there any other comments, questions? If not,
There's some on.
oh yes, I will turn to the online
Right,
audience
we can read
for
the
more
one, how can
questions.
we ensure that funds allocated for the SDGs are used effectively and transparently?
Right, so we have 3 important questions, right? Funds, how can we make sure that funds, the distribution of funds for the SDGs are used effectively and in a transparent manner? We have the second question on the modalities for the papers, and also the question on some insights, right, to the process here. So if any of the panelists would like to respond to that, yes, please.
Okay, so I guess it's me going first. I'll go backwards. So starting with the question from online about funds being used effectively and transparently. The first thing about financing for development is that we're talking about whole financial systems, right? We're talking about decent jobs. How do you create a system that creates decent jobs for people? So it's broader than just funds, but of course there are funds, and there's public funds, there's official development assistance, there's funds from the development banks. And it is a question, it's something that a lot of work is going into, and it was actually very discussed in Sevilla, was how do we do a better job of monitoring those funds? How do we do a better job of not just monitoring them and say, often in the international system, there'll be a project, you'll go to a donor, you'll have a project, and then you'll say, did we do what we said we would do? That doesn't have anything to do with what's the actual impact of this. Does it actually change anything? So we try for theories of change, but it's always a little bit, so there's a lot of thinking going on in the system of how can we actually try to measure real impact. And I think that's something we're creating a work stream on, and it's something that I think there's no answer yet. It's not easy to do, but it's something we all understand we have to do better than we're doing it. In terms of modalities, I think here is a very good place to go. So you have the major group on children and youth, and I think we don't always, there are different times and different processes when there is a call for public inputs. And those, then you can just send it in. But I think that even more than that is if you have those that are following the processes and can say at this point in time, it's a really good time, or if there's something you're working on and you want to bring it, then send it to us. So then, of course, there's no setup way to do it, except we have the major group, and the major group can do it. So we're very happy to work with you on those areas. And in terms of youth from developing countries, I'm going to let some of the youth from developing countries maybe talk about how some of the best ways to get involved on the country level, or maybe I'll pass that to the other colleagues.
No, of course. I think that youth in developing countries, the first thing that you should do is designate and also research and look for different NGOs in your area that you can contribute meaningfully, maybe written statements or writing statements, for example, the DMUN Foundation, and all of the resources to be able to contribute your perspective, the Secretary in all these different realms. And thank you, Sherry, for contributing the perspective that the Secretary at all these levels are there for the youth and that they genuinely want to hear your perspective. See, the conventions of the United Nations that constitute whether the youth should be given a seat or not, whether that seat has any real power, they're there and they're outdated. And the Secretariat, they acknowledge that themselves. But if you want to contribute meaningfully, then you need to try the best that you can do in your capacity, right? If you're in a third world country and you want to advocate meaningfully, I'd say the NGO pathway is definitely the greatest thing. Constituencies such as MGCY host a platform for you to be able to do these things where they take in perspectives from all over the world, right? So I'd say, especially if you're going through ffd-4, something that you should look for is addressing debt and financial gaps, right? You must engage directly with issues, right? So there's sovereign debt, illicit financial flows, and also just different constituencies going on, right? So recently we had the ad hoc committee on international governmental tax cooperation, right? That is something the DMUN Foundation meaningfully engaged with collaboration through MGCY. And the DMUN Foundation is very, very open to opening the floor to many youth perspectives, so they'd be able to carry that over. In fact, multiple Google Forms are sent out to gather those perspectives and bring them to the forefront. So this means for the youth that are in these first world countries, for the youth that are actually able to show up and represent, you need to take into account that that you're representing a huge body, and that you have a task and you have a mandate to deliver for everyone, not just your own goals, but the people who may have not been able to do it, the people who had to attend on Zoom, right? So you need to keep that in mind and also represent well and meaningfully, and also for the people in third world countries, contribute your perspectives, please.
And it's such a better world with technology than it ever
Yeah.
was for being able to participate, but still issues of access, et cetera.
So, it's interesting, right? I think I completely agree with this idea that when you represent all youth everywhere. But then it comes to the other question, for those who are, despite technology, not able to access technology and still cannot be part of that Zoom conversation. 2.6 billion people remain unconnected around the world from the latest ITU statistics. And so how do you make sure that even in these conversations, if it's about something as critical as tax or financing, those views are represented? And that's where, okay, even if youth from countries, developing countries can be on Zoom, how can you guys, via your own networks, your family networks, the community service projects that you're involved in where you go to other parts of the world, try as much to be consciously inclusive in thinking about these issues and what you see then reflecting into your own positions in thinking. So for sure, especially listen to the voices of here that attend the Zoom and make sure you amplify that and have that as a conscious part of your platforms because you have the privilege to be here. And then in other ways as well that are not technology driven, but by direct social impact and interaction, think about what their perspectives can be as part of
Yes. And of course, I agree with that. And I also think that something you mentioned beforehand, that you should also get involved with your government, right? If you're in third world country, you need to share your perspective with the ambassadors that are actually going to be going. They have the funding to actually represent the country or the actual stakeholder mandate in these different negotiations, right? So you think multilateral, you throw out big names, United Nations, rented woods associations, but where it starts is the grassroots work and what your country thinks, and what the NGOs in your country and what the different youth perspectives in your country believe, and that's what's represented in the main front. That's what's represented when your ambassador goes to a specific conference, right? So something to start off with is addressing the issue in your local community, addressing the issue at a statewide level if you're here in the United States, right? Because addressing those issues first and foremost, you get to see the change around you. And also, that change can be brought to different multilateral systems as well.
I was just gonna, oh, sorry.
Just to add to your list of things that you can get involved in at the national level. The UN actually runs what's called the Internet Governance, the IGF, the Internet Governance Forum. And they actually have national and regional IGFs. They are very active in local chapters around the world. They have also youth IGFs, where there is that intersection between youth participation in digital internet governance issues, and they have very strong chapters locally. There are also a lot of other internet-related organizations that focus a lot on making sure that it's about community impact. So for instance, the Internet Society, the Internet Foundation, a lot of them have regional and local chapters that are present in countries. I would strongly encourage you, who are all of those of you online and here as well, that's interested in this digital type issues, and perhaps that intersection with digital as well as broader multilateral type issues, to get involved with your local youth IGF or your national IGFs.
And I would just say that the UN is the one place where every country in the world has a seat with an equal vote. And so it's really important that on the national level to be influencing and to be discussing and to be lobbying your own policymakers on the country level. In the financing space, there's a process that we actually do with UNDP called Integrated National Financing Frameworks. But the idea for these different discussions is to have multi-stakeholder discussions in countries to influence these financing frameworks that are being developed in the country. And then those are then brought to discussions at the UN. And so when those things exist, find out what's happening on your country level and see how to get involved is the best way probably.
Yes, and I think with all the reflections that we've just had, I mean, there's a lot of very important discussions, right? Because I think there's really two elements of the perspective, right? I think as children and youth, we recognize these limitations, but also I don't think we're thinking from the other side of the table, right? Because I think in the perspective of secretariats, I mean, their main purpose is to fulfill the mandate given by member states. And there is definitely, as you said, budgetary, other restrictions. The one you said about insurance of ffd-4, I think, resonates a lot because we need safeguarding for children, and I mean that cannot be compromised, definitely. And I think the real key in this problem will lie on sort of the compromise and sort of the perspectives that we can really correlate to not only recognize the problems we face, but also the problems that the other multi-stakeholders, other stakeholders face in trying to really provide children and youth with a space. Because what I'm feeling here and what I have felt working in the FFD space is there's NGOs, secretariats, member states, IGOs who are really willing to include children and youth. It's just that that problem is something that they cannot unilaterally fix. We need partnerships and to make that big leap forward. And I think that's something that none of our organizations or groups can do just on our own. And I think that is really an important element. And now I want to give a final round of questions to everyone. So please.
Yeah, actually, Borne, I come from the Philippines, but I'm based here. I'm a certified public accountant, and I'm very much, interested in the ffd-4. And I understand that the GRI sustainability reporting standards have already recently been adopted by the UN. So I think in terms of involving the youth to kind of like what you've said, multi-stakeholder engagement, they can help lobby their own governments to adopt those sustainability reporting standards, so that our the private sector would have pressure. We could put the pressure on the private sector to help and engage and finance sustainable development goals. So I think that's something that we can add into the discussion.
Right. Oh yes, please.
Hi, my name is Matt Lee. I'm a local New York high schooler. And my question is, what concrete mechanisms are in place in these institutions and organizations that you've talked about, like at the ffd-4 or in SDG implementation, that really shows that this youth participation is actually impactful rather than just being symbolic?
Yes, I think there was one question at the back. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Farhan. I'm also 15 years old, and it's great seeing that someone youth like me is representing both as the speaker. My question to you is, I've had experience with my own organization, contacting council member and getting stuff done on a local level. What are some steps that you've taken to kind of get, onto the panel, or take deeper steps to you and to make global change, even outside from the
Right, and we'll take one final question from the virtual audience. If anyone is trying to send
There's a question right there.
was there one more question at the back? Right.
I thought so.
Is there one? If there's one, please raise it. Oh yes, please.
I wanted to ask a question. It's on AI, and you mentioned AI. I was just asking about the global south. How is the structure? How do you think that each pioneer AI in the midst of the next big?
Yes. If there's no questions from the virtual audience, I think we can give the floor to each of our distinguished panelists for their responses.
I'll take the AI. So this is actually something we're concerned with at UNDP, because we think that the trajectory of AI development is precisely, as you said, going to exclude global south. So what I told you about how, for instance, only 10% of the global value of AI will accrue to the global south is something that will perpetuate existing inequalities to divide between the north and south, and the fact that ultimately global south will become consumers of data, algorithms, and AI platforms and products that are created not in the global south but by the global north, and then exported to the global south, for which you don't have to pay. So I think what is really critically important is that in all these financing conversations, we talk about how we direct financing, resource, capacity development to investments in the global south. Now, to build global south AI ecosystems, to empower AI startups, to really also give youth in the global south that talent and skills to compete on the global markets, and find a way to retain the talent in the global south so that, even after they graduate with a PhD from, let's say, MIT or Tsinghua University, they don't stay in China or America, but go back to their home countries and really help to bolster the local AI ecosystem, AI startups, to create locally relevant AI data sets, algorithms, and products that can then reflect what the global south truly needs. And so that's why I do think we have to be consciously reflecting on the inequities that exist now and try to find ways systematically to prevent that from going forward. We've seen already how this happens in a lot of digital technologies, right? You're on Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, all these are models and companies that started in the global north and exported to the global south. So how do we strengthen, for instance, locally built communications platforms, entrepreneurship platforms, selling platforms that are created by global south entrepreneurs and used by global south? So I think the other two questions, I'll leave it to the other panelists. But for us at UNDP, this is a heavy priority. That's why we're investing through a lot of our projects to build that kind of capacity in development countries. So,
With lack of time, I just think the final statement should definitely come from Director Spiegel. Please, if you want to highlight any of the questions.
No, I just wanted to make a comment because I thought your comment on sustainability is really, really important. 5 years ago, 7 years ago, we were all thinking that the world was saying, well, the youth are going to force businesses to change their demand structure, their consumption structure, their demands. And now there's enormous backlash against sustainability, and at least in some countries. And we see it going the other way, and those youth voices are more important than ever. So on things like sustainability standards, please come be involved. There will be working streams and issues that are working on these very issues, on GRI standards, on what does it mean, how can countries start implementing them. And we would love to work with you together to bring voices, to put pressures on governments. Well, we don't put pressures, we have the Secretariat, but for you to put pressure on issues that you think are really important. So again, you can work through the major group, but really it's really wonderful to be here, to hear your thoughts, to hear what you're all thinking, and really encourage you on issues like that, but on all issues that are important, to please be part of the conversation. And we as the Secretariat will do our best to bring your voices to the discussion.
Yes, I mean, this truly has been a very wonderful conversation where, as we said, it's really about building bridges. I think if I had to summarize the entire conversation in just one word, in one phrase, which is so hard, it is really about that, understanding others and building bridges, because I think we really need that in this time during multilateralism, where we consider other parties' perspectives and know their limitations and try to create a compromise where we can all work together. And I think this conversation truly is the first step to that, for youth and children understanding the limitations of certain institutions and the abilities that they have on the multilateral system, and for them to also understand what the limitations that youth feel from engaging with these processes. And I think that really provides us with a path for a better and more equitable and inclusive future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, MGCY, and these distinguished panelists. I certainly learned a lot about building bridges in the future of sustainability and the SDGs leading up to the SDG Summit in 2027. We've been so fortunate to welcome MGCY and their panelists in partnership with the International Organization of Youth at this International Youth Conference, and we're so happy to have them. Thank you for all of your insights. Our next session, we will now break for lunch. Our next session will resume at 1 p.m. with the title, Shaping a Just Future, Youth Driving Human Rights and Gender Equality. So make sure you're back here for this, but we have until 1 p.m. Feel free to mingle, get lunch, and return here by 1 p.m. Thank you so much.
Can we get another round of applause?
Yes.